Rediscover God's Word, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. This is Real Bible Study with teacher Tom Bradford. Welcome to Torah Class.
Verse 8 of Obadiah chapter 1, and there is only one chapter in Obadiah, was our drop-off point in the previous lesson. And we closed with highlighting that the phrases, when that day comes, the day of the Lord, the day of Jehovah, or just the day, these all refer to the same thing. An event of the Lord's judgment and wrath. And that wrath has in the past fallen on Israel, as well as on a few of the many Gentile nations of the world. And the same is prophesied in Obadiah to happen again in the end times, only on a far larger scale. Now, as we study Bible prophecy, the question for us all is, are we really nearing the end times? Are we in the end times? And if we are, what exactly does that look like? What is its real world effect on us personally, on our nation, on our world in general? See, the problem that we face is that life experience is relative. That is, we actually only have our individual generational experience to go by that feels real to us. Okay. We can read history books, the Bible. We can have our parents and grandparents tell us what life was like for them. But just how tangible or applicable does that feel for us? See, we all face this frog in the kettle syndrome, in that changes in the world conditions generally happen slowly or sometimes incrementally, such that we're adapting as we go. And, it just means that in a relatively short time, those changes become our new normal. And so we move on. This is what makes Bible prophecy and its fulfillment hard for us to detect, to even accept. And especially in the modern anti-God, trust science worldview that is the new norm for the Western world, it is just not socially acceptable to see dramatic or even subtle world events as associated with biblical prophecy. And that's a trap we must avoid as believers. And with the risk of being labeled a hysteric or a backward-thinking person, I tell you that what we are reading about in Obadiah and in other prophetic books about Israel and the Gentile nations in the end times, it's underway. And it may be early in the process, but it's here, now. And if you believe that, or if you think it might be true, then pay close attention, because you're likely going to personally have to deal with what is being foretold. Well, and if not, well, then everything you're going to hear from me is just science fiction and fairy tales. In the book of Obadiah, Edom is the primary focus as the recipient of God's wrath. However, Edom is meant to be viewed in two forms. One, as the sovereign nation itself, and two, as the representative type of all the Gentile nations of the world. That is, while it might not happen simultaneously, the sorts of things that God's wrath will bring down on Edom will happen in like kind to all or many of the nations of the world. What is just as important to recognize is that God's wrath will be directed towards these nations for the same reasons it will be with Edom. It'll be because of their bad treatment of, their lack of support for Israel. This reality will become more apparent as we go along in today's lesson. So, the best way to set the direction of today's lesson is to reread Obadiah, starting at verse 8. So open your Bibles, and we're going to start at verse 8 of Obadiah. Starting at verse 8. When that day comes, says Adonai, won't I destroy all the wise men of Edom and leave no discernment on Mount Esau? Your warriors, Taman, will be so distraught that everyone on Mount Esau will be slaughtered. For the violence done to your kinsman Jacob, shame will cover you, and you will be forever cut off. On that day you stood aside, while strangers carried off his treasure, and foreigners entered his gates to cast lots for Jerusalem. You were no different from them. You shouldn't have gloated over your kinsmen on their day of disaster, or rejoiced over the people of Judah on their day of destruction. You shouldn't have spoken arrogantly on a day of trouble, or entered the gate of my people on their day of calamity. No, you shouldn't have gloated over their suffering on their day of calamity, or laid hands on their treasure on their day of calamity. You shouldn't have stood at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives and handed over their survivors on a day of trouble. For the day of Adonai is near for all nations. As you did, it will be done to you. Your dealings will come back on your own head. For just as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so will all the nations drink in turn. Yes, they will drink and gulp it down and be as if they had never existed. But on Mount Zion, there will be a holy remnant who will escape, and the house of Jacob will repossess their rightful inheritance. The house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, setting aflame, consuming the stubble, which is the house of Esau. None of the house of Esau will remain, for Adonai has spoken. Those in the Negev will repossess the mountain of Esau, those in the Shephelah, the land of the Philistines. They will repossess the field of Ephraim, the field of Shomron, and Benjamin will occupy Gilead. Those from this army of the people of Israel, exiled among the Canaanites as far away as Sarfat, and the exiles from Jerusalem and Sepharad, will repossess the cities in the Negev. Then the victorious will ascend to Mount Zion to rule over Mount Esau, but the kingship will belong to Adonai. You know, just as parents are often dismayed as their children arrive at the legal age of adulthood, and for a few years afterward, hopefully very few, do not reflect any kind of wisdom, but rather seem to make decisions and choices that are baffling, at times self-defeating. So according to verse 8, it's going to be for Edom. The term wise men of Edom, that means their leadership, religious, governmental, academic. The men that are in a position of influence and authority who have been counted on to make the best possible decisions for the welfare of the people and the continuation of the homeland. But now those same people who have heretofore helped Edom to ascend in power and wealth and prestige seem to forsake the wisdom they claim to have, and instead they make unwise decisions that send their nation into this downward spiral. Now, the concept being spoken of here is that the unwise decisions of Edom's leading men include policies of bad, oppressive treatment of Israel, or simply a lack of support when other nations might oppress or attack Israel. Now, nothing I've just said is difficult to understand. What is harder, however, is to move this beyond an ethereal concept without form to a clear mental picture of just what that could look like in practice. Verses 12 through 14 helps to draw that clear mental picture by God telling Edom what they must not do as regards Israel. And we're going to get into more of those kinds of details shortly. I mentioned in our introduction to Obadiah that this book is very complex, both in its message and in its construction. The first 18 verses are mostly Hebrew poetry. So we have to be looking more to the thought pattern being presented than to the exact literal meaning. That is, Obadiah is quite difficult from a technical standpoint to interpret. So there is little choice than to examine the sentence structures, the choice of words from a biblical Hebrew grammar approach, combined with how certain words and thoughts are used in Hebrew poetry versus how those same words are used in normal rhetoric in order to extract proper meaning. So I apologize in advance for the detail in which we're going to look at some of these sentences, but without doing so, we're going to miss much of what Obadiah is telling us. Now, in Obadiah chapter 1, verse 8, Jehovah says that he will destroy the wise from Edom. Now, because of the Hebrew grammar, which technically is combining a personal object with a verb, the notion of destroying the wise means that those wise men, the leadership of Edom, will literally die, thus also indicating their complete removal from the scene. This is versus destruction, more meaning they're just removed from power or their personal reputations are ruined. As a consequence of these men's deaths, Edom will find itself a rudderless ship. A rudderless ship wanders aimlessly and is also easily overtaken. Now, one of the reasons that the subject of wisdom is brought up is that in the ancient era, Edom was widely known for its wisdom. Likely this wisdom was of a purely humanistic, secular type that allowed for economic expansion, along with creating a strong military manifested by the political decisions that the leaders made. But according to the prophecy, there will be a reversal of fortune. These wise men will die and leave Edom with other leaders who will not be adept at leading the nation. This will lead to its weakness and to its downfall. And of course, this is what has happened throughout history to nearly every nation that has ever existed. And it continues to happen that way in modern times. Now, the mention of Mount Esau is more than a parallel term with Edom. Remember, what we are looking at is Hebrew poetry. So this sort of thought pattern structure is regularly used, but it also serves to remind us that Edom's founder is Esau. Esau is not just a founding father, the way the USA might look at George Washington. He is far more than a historic figure or a fact. Biblically speaking, Esau represents all those who are not in covenant with God, while his brother Jacob, called Israel, represents all those who are. This is why we must pay close attention to what happens to Edom, because the same is going to happen for all those nations whose leaders and people are not in covenant with God, so are automatically opposed to Israel. Now, God gave a similar message to others of his prophets, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. In Jeremiah, we read this in Jeremiah 49, 7 and 8. Concerning Edom, this is what Adonai Zephod says. Is there no wisdom left in Teman? Have her wise men forgotten how to counsel? Has their wisdom vanished? Flee, turn back, hide yourselves well, you who live in Dedan, for I am bringing calamity on Esau when the time for me to punish him comes. Ezekiel 25, verses 12 and 13. Adonai Elohim says, because Edom has taken severe vengeance against the house of Judah, incurring much guilt by its acts of vengeance against them. Therefore, Adonai Elohim says, I will stretch out my hand over Edom and eliminate both its humans and its animals. I'll make it a ruin. From Teman to Dedan, they will die by the sword. In verse 9 of Obadiah, we're told that Edom's warriors, or more literally, they're mighty men, which indicates war heroes more than simply run-of-the-mill soldiers, will become terrified and therefore become ineffective. That is, either they run from the enemy or they throw down their weapons and surrender. When before this event, they were among the bravest, fiercest of all their warriors. In my opinion, what most likely causes this seeming swing from bravery to cowardness is actually more a sense within Edom's battlefield military commanders that their nation's leadership is not worth fighting for. They're not willing to lay down their lives or ask their soldiers under them to lay down their lives for an incompetent or morally corrupt leadership who sees the soldiers as but cannon fodder for their political ambitions and personal wealth aspirations. This is, again, something that has happened all throughout history. And it's happening again in modern times. And when the soldiers of a nation's military feel they have nothing worthy to fight for, they are reluctant to lay down their lives just because they're told to do so. So at best, they become an ineffective fighting force. At worst, they simply refuse to fight. Therefore, the absence of effective military protection results in the enemy slaughtering the nation's leadership. And in this way, wisdom is removed from Edom, and its demise becomes complete. This is what I think these prophetic words are getting at. Now, the mention of Teman is interesting. And for no other reason, there's no academic agreement on what or where it is. Okay, some think it's a city in southern or southeastern Edom. Others think it's the entire southerly region of Edom. Others think it's actually up north in Edom and associated with the known city of Bosra. Now, be that as it may, in the end, what we can be certain of is that the term Teman, and especially when it pairs with the term Bosra, is but another word to indicate all of Edom. So such a multiple use of terms for the same place, well, that's just common in Hebrew poetry. Now, verse 10 explicitly explains just why God is going to intervene in human affairs and cause this slaughter of Edom's leadership and the disbanding of Edom as a nation. It's because of the violence and harm Edom has done against Israel. Very likely, this is much less about any direct armed attack of Edom against Israel. It's quite interesting that as I write this lesson in the early spring of 2024, Israel is in a war for its existence against an Islamic faction called Hamas. In Hebrew, the word for violence is Hamas. And that is the word that's actually used in this verse. Hamas in Arabic carries with it the sense of zealousness as in battle. What's also rather fascinating is that in both the Hebrew and Aramaic sense of the word, Hamas includes murder and rape and the acquisition of the property and land of another through unjust means. Kind of interesting, isn't it? The October 7th, 2023 sneak attack upon Israel by the Islamic faction Hamas included barbarous and murderous atrocities, along with sexual violence against little girls and women. And their goal is to boot Israel from their land in order to make it an Islamic Palestinian state. Now, can this mention of Hamas in prophecy be pure coincidence? Can it also be coincidence that we find explicit biblical prophecies saying that Edom, which is Jordan today, is going to bear the brunt of God's wrath because of Hamas against Israel? Or ought we take it as yet another example of prophecy unfolding before our very eyes, even though the bulk of Christianity denies it? What is also interesting is that the Islamic faction called Hamas is not a Jordanian-inspired organization. It's Iranian. And yet Jordan fully supports and it aids Hamas's purposes, intentions, and actions against Israel. And what we coincidentally find in historical reality is that Edom itself is not really associated with too much in the way of direct military confrontation with Israel, but rather they are known more for their cooperation and support for the military actions against Israel that comes from other nations. Perhaps the most infamous of all was when Babylon invaded Israel and led the people into exile early in the 6th century BC, and Edom aided and supported that action. In the next few verses, that scenario is actually discussed in terms of what Edom should not have done. Now, what greatly exacerbates this matter is that Esau is a literal brother to Israel, to Jacob. It's one thing for Edom to aid and abet an unjust attack on some nation at large, but to do it on a brother nation is beyond the pale. At least it is in God's eyes. To do it to the nation that God has made covenant with, well, that's the worst of the worst. God has made a covenant with exactly one people and one nation in all human history: Israel. So when someone determines to stand against Israel, that person or nation has put him or herself or itself against God, because God is the guarantor of that covenant. Now, this is not some ancient myth or protocol that has since become retired. It is the critical factor in everything that is prophesied to happen in the end times and beyond. Yet, because the Constantinian Church has so blatantly and blasphemously made it a bedrock principle that the Gentile church has replaced Israel as God's covenant people, then everyday Christians simply can't understand what is happening as regards Israel today in terms of prophetic biblical fulfillments. If you are hearing this message, then any excuse you might have had as you stand before God that you're innocent because you didn't know, well, that's just evaporated. Those with ears hear. Now, the resulting consequence for Edom will be shame, we're told. Now, listen, shame is not an emotion like the term ashamed means. Shame is a most negative social status one does not want to have in a shame and honor-based society. This type of society is the basis of all Islamic-oriented societies, so the whole of the Middle East operates on shame and honor. Shame is the opposite of honor. All people operating in a shame and honor system necessarily must be in a state of honor to function normally within their society. To exist in a state of shame, well, that's intolerable. And so any means to shuck it off and return to a state of honor will be used, even if it results in that person's death. So the prophecy is that all the people of Edom, modern-day Jordan, will be relegated to a social status of shame. A truly terrible thing for them that has nearly no possible remedy. I want to explain something to you about the intense hatred that exists for Israel since its modern rebirth as a nation in 1948 to try to make all this more real to us. See, Islam has a core belief that any piece of land that a Muslim steps foot upon is now Muslim land. Since Muslims lived for centuries, usually as nomads, passing through the general area of modern Israel, then for them, that land is inherently Muslim. That the offspring of Jacob, Israel, now dwells there as a nation, well, this causes great shame upon all Muslims. And even worse, the several wars of Arab and Persian nations against Israel, all of them resulting in losing, heaps even further shame upon Muslims from their point of view. This is why there exists such seemingly irrational hatred against Israel, and it is why no compromise between Islam and Israel, in which Israel continues as a Jewish state, is possible. You know, one need only hear the chant from mobs all over the world of, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," to grasp the Muslim worldview. The river and the chant's the Jordan, the sea's the Mediterranean. In other words, all of Israel. So even in the chant we've all heard on TV and on social media of mobs demonstrating against Israel, their goal is explicitly being stated for all the world to hear. The sphere of Islam cannot escape their shame. They cannot return to a place of honor until Israel no longer exists. It is the only remedy according to the protocols of a shame and honor society. And according to the doctrines of Islam, there is no option B. There is no possible political compromise. Well, the final words of verse 10 say, Edom will be cut off forever. This has never yet happened in history. So this means that the incidences in the past of Edom supporting Israel's enemies, as with the Babylonian invasion, have not been terminal, like the one that will happen in the end times. The final incidents of Edom, of Jordan, coming against Israel will result in them no longer existing, with no hope of ever being reestablished. Here's the thing. Remember that the term Edom is both the name of a specific nation and its people, as well as a representative type of all Gentile nations in general. Since this is an end times prophecy, it means that God's wrath against these nations means those nations, as currently constituted, will cease to exist. So the effect being spoken of here will extend far beyond the nation of Jordan, possibly to the shores of every nation of every person hearing me. Now, verse 11 is a little bit odd. Seems a little disjointed. We're going to see if there's a way to approach it that makes it a little more connected. First, though, we need to notice that grammatically speaking, this verse speaks of a past event as opposed to something future in the end times. And it is why many Bible scholars think this prophecy was written after the Babylonian conquest of Judah in the early 6th century BC. A few scholars have suggested that for the sake of understanding this better, and again, this is Hebrew poetry, so every word or sentence is presented in its most readable, straightforward way, we can do a rearrangement of the verse's component parts to make it clear. Now, let me say it plainly. No one's suggesting there's a problem with the text itself. It's merely trying to understand the verse's intent as we try to see it through the ancient literary style. So here's what it says in the order as it's given. On that day you stood aside while strangers carried off his treasure and foreigners entered his gates to cast lots for Jerusalem. You were no different from them. Now, a way that works better for modern English-speaking Westerners is this. On that day you stood aside while foreigners entered his gates. And on that day when strangers carried off his treasure and cast lots for Jerusalem. Now, this works much better if for no other reason it puts the actions in proper order. I mean, obviously the foreign invaders have to enter the city gates before they can carry off the property located from inside the city walls. So God condemns Edom for standing aside and allowing the invading army into Jerusalem rather than defending the city along with their brother Israel. They act as a hostile witness to what is happening, or they're completely unconcerned about it. It is of note that the prophecy stresses the idea of foreigners or strangers attacking Jerusalem. See, when we think of family relationships, foreigners and strangers are those who are outside of the family dynamic. Of utmost importance is that these attacking nations are people outside of those who are God's covenant people. In his commentary on Obadiah, Paul Raby says that the context of the word foreigners or strangers is very much akin to the English word barbarians. So this is a pretty nasty epithet against the Babylonian invaders and their pals, the Edomites. And such a divine viewpoint indicates the idea that Edom is no different than Babylon, even though Edom would argue that they are different. And I can't stress sufficiently a biblical principle that is found throughout the Old Testament. Siding with Israel's enemy makes you Israel's enemy. Siding with Israel's enemy also makes you siding against the God of Israel. There's a movement today, particularly within the West, including America, says it's not anti-Semitic to side with Palestine against Israel. Rather, this is only a personal or a political stance, not a religious stance. That is but a modern invention that attempts to slice that onion far too thin. Humans might try to draw that distinction to offer a difference, but Jehovah does not. Another scenario that is especially prevalent in the evangelical branches of Christianity is a naive determination to take an even-handed approach. That is, support and care about Israel as much as they support and care about Israel's enemies. In fact, it's my opinion that what we see today in the church hovers somewhere between full support for Hamas and the people of Gaza and trying to provide equal support for both sides. Therefore, not taking firm sides is said to be the loving, godly approach for a believer. Well, we see no such choice available in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we read the following about the nature of attempted neutrality or even-handedness in Revelation 3, 15, and 16. I know what you're doing. You're neither hot nor cold. How I wish you were one or the other. So because you're lukewarm, neither hot or cold, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. See, wow, this runs against the grain. But taking sides is the duty of God worshipers. Being neither hot nor cold, neutrality, choosing neither good nor evil, acting like Switzerland, this is not an option for believers. We're to stand with God's covenant people and nation without reservation. That doesn't mean we have to agree with their every political decision. But as in the case of this current Gaza-Israel war, it certainly wasn't started by Israel. They were attacked. Now they're fighting back. But the world, and many within the Christian sphere, is throwing its support against Israel and for the Palestinians. Now, this is going to have long-lasting consequences of the most negative kind for those foolish enough to think they can have it both ways. Now, the idea of casting lots for Jerusalem is probably not literal, but rather it's said to make a point. See, casting lots was a common way in ancient times to help make a decision. And it was used to decide how to divide up something of value. The problem here is that Jerusalem equals Mount Zion. And Mount Zion equals the place God calls his own. It is where he rules from in a figurative sense and will rule from in a literal sense in the millennial kingdom. So for an enemy to think they can divide up and take that which belongs to God, well, that's just folly. It doesn't mean they might not try, that they may not succeed for a time, but in the end, such an act is just suicidal. Now, as we approach verses 12 through 14, we are prepared for what God says Edom ought not have done. And it speaks of Edom's open hostility towards Israel, primarily Judah, and what it was they did to demonstrate that hostility that will lead to their extinction. So what did Obadiah, verses 12 through 14, say? It says, you should not have gloated over your kinsmen on their day of disaster, or rejoiced over the people of Judah on their day of destruction. You should not have spoken arrogantly on a day of trouble, or entered the gate of my people on their day of calamity. No, you shouldn't have gloated over their suffering on their day of calamity, or laid hands on their treasure on their day of calamity. You shouldn't have stood at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, or handed over their survivors on a day of trouble. Now, these 8 quite specific commands of what Edom should not have done in the past, and by extrapolation, better not do in the end times, although we already know that they will do all those things again. It's because Edom is modern-day Jordan. We can see what Jordan has done and is doing regarding Israel. While not all 8 actions are happening by Jordan, some are, such as gloating over Israel on the day of their calamity. Now, I want to say some things to you now that are quite hard for me to do, because it is not my practice nor goal to ever be political. On the other hand, what I must speak about is so current that it's just not possible to speak of it in terms that avoid indicating which side of the political aisle the current leaders of the West and of America represent. I'm going to do this because the seriousness of the matter is so tremendous. Because it is precisely what the prophecy of Obadiah is addressing, that we need to take it to heart. We need to act upon it where we can. America and the West initially were behind Israel after the people of Gaza, led by Hamas, attacked, killed, raped, and kidnapped hundreds of Israeli citizens, some of whom, now almost 6 months later, are still being held. These include the elderly, the disabled, children, even babies. Now, however, American and European leaders of the current governing administrations have become far more concerned with the welfare of the people that perpetrated this atrocity than for those who suffered it. The people that danced in the streets when the Israeli hostages were brought to Gaza, when some of the murdered Israelis were pulled naked through the streets behind vehicles and spit upon, when Hamas's own videos they took of the bloodshed were proudly put out on the internet, well, they're now being depicted as victims. Israel, which is fighting for its right to existence, and through great sacrifices making excellent inroads to destroying the army of Gaza and its leadership, are being told by America's president and his State Department, and virtually all the leaders of the European nations, they must stand down. The enemy continues to hold on to the hostages, continues to fire rockets indiscriminately into Israel, continues to maintain its stance. They will never be satisfied until their goal of wiping Israel off the face of the earth is accomplished. They refuse to back down, refuse to surrender, upon which time the fighting would stop. And their decimated cities and towns could begin the long task of rebuilding. But Israel is now viewed as being in the wrong. It's being threatened by the leadership of what to this point has been its greatest ally, the USA. The UN just passed a resolution demanding that Israel stop fighting. And rather than veto it, the USA only abstained from voting, which is essentially a yes vote. The World Court in The Hague is hearing a series of actions brought by various nations wanting Israel's leadership arrested and put on trial for defending themselves and trying to rout out a great evil that is Hamas. The UN organization called UNRWA was caught red-handed, helping Hamas attack Israel, and a number of nations stopped supporting it. Now, in the name of fairness, most nations have turned back on the money spouts so that millions and millions of dollars are directed to UNRWA so that it will flow to Gaza, but in reality, that flows into the hands of Hamas. In the USA, at college campuses throughout the nation, thousands and thousands of students and teachers have marched in support of Gaza and Hamas and in condemnation of Israel, even of Jews in general. Same thing's being repeated all over Europe. But worse, America's traditional churches send up prayers for the Palestinians. They send money for aid to join them. They join in condemning Israel for battling so fiercely against Hamas. They blame Israel for the conflagration, saying that if Israel had just given the enemy what they wanted in the first place, none of this would have happened. They say it's only right that Israel should give up more land and be supportive of an independent Palestinian state with a corridor, by the way, built through the heart of Israel that joins Gaza with the West Bank. Now, how does all this square with what we have read today in Obadiah or in others of the prophets? If you are the Constantinian church, you say it doesn't matter because the Old Testament no longer matters. If you are the Constantinian church, often you'll say that since Jesus is love, so we are to love the Palestinians equally with the Israeli Jews. And I say to you, that is simply not so, and you are deceived. Such a stance is not biblical. It only expresses the modern attitude of replacing God's definitions of love, mercy, and justice with our own emotions. The other thing I must say is this. Clearly, the tide has turned. One side of America's political aisle and the West in general are now staunchly and proudly anti-Israel, anti-Jew. I don't have to say which side it is, because it's on our news media every hour of every day, and the words are present in our politicians' speeches. Some of the steps taken to harm Israel probably can't be undone by a new regime who feels more positive towards Israel, even if one was to be put into power. So I'm compelled to alert you. If God's word is true, and it is, then what other conclusion is possible? Except that our future, that in any way resembles a history of or a hope for blessing and bounty, is greatly in doubt. History proves that nations that go against God's recorded will and against God's people do not thrive or survive in the long run. Calamities within those nations increase in proportion to their morality decreasing and oppression of the Jewish people increasing. Abundance gives way to scarcity. Stability and peace give way to aimlessness and turmoil. Wisdom and common sense flee, and they are replaced with convoluted humanistic ideals from our intellectuals and irrational governing philosophies of politicians that have never proved workable, only destructive. And yet those nations and ideals and philosophies are embraced to the death, no matter how much society may intensify in its crumbling. Folks, the bottom line is that Israel's, listen to me. Just look up here, stop looking at your paperwork. The bottom line is Israel's ongoing existence is assured by God. It's assured. On the flip side, our existence as a nation is not. In fact, our nation's destruction and the destruction of most nations, that's what's assured. And I caution the church, again, you cannot go against God's chosen people, Israel, and think that you are in good standing with the Almighty. Doesn't work that way. You can't stand with Israel's enemies and be blessed. You can't straddle a fence of your own making that exists between good and evil. You can't blur the distinction between God's covenant people and those who are not. Constantinian church, and that is who you are, even though you don't even know your own history. God made all of his covenants, including the new covenant, with Israel, not with you. You, all of us, we have one way and only one way to become part of those covenants, and that is to be joined to God's covenant people. Trusting in Messiah Yeshua allows us to be grafted into the covenant people of Israel by bowing to God's covenants with Israel and accepting and obeying the terms and provisions of those covenants. All of them. And if we claim we've done so, I'm going to tell you something. It's irrational to say that we also support Israel's enemies. It's irrational. Because, think about it. In doing so, we're saying we support our own enemies. And we all know that's neither possible nor true. I mean, a house divided against itself cannot stand. But I want to also say that in my opinion, America and the West can now expect only increasing turmoil, lawlessness, chaos, and catastrophes as God pulls back from us, and justly so. I mean, I'm going to never forget, going on 20 years ago, on August 15th, 2005, after unbearable pressure had been applied upon Israel by America and Europe to empty Gaza of thousands of Jews who had lived there for decades, and to turn it over to the Palestinians only 8 days later, one of the worst calamities ever to hit America, Hurricane Katrina, happened. 8 days. A very few brave pastors had the guts to suggest out loud that the connections between the two events were remarkable and simply could not be coincidence. However, our government and the Pope and most of Protestant Christianity denounced those pastors for what they said. I have little doubt that soon, when something terrible and unprecedented again happens, there will be some who rightly see the connection and say so, but most will deny it because they're blind to it. I guess at this point, I think we've crossed over some cosmic line in the sand. I have serious doubts that we're going to be able to do enough repenting to bring God's blessings back upon our nation. I hope I'm wrong. So as I've been urging you for some time now, if you know turmoil and catastrophe are coming your way, what should you do? How about prepare? Prepare your spiritual life. Prepare your pantry. Prepare your finances. Prepare. God's gracious to tell us in advance what's coming, even if the dates and times are provided. And what is He always calling us to do? Prepare. And if we'll only listen and believe, He tells us what triggers His wrath. Obadiah tells us what that trigger is. And I believe the trigger has been pulled. Okay, we'll continue with Obadiah next time.
For more teachings of real Bible study and to rediscover God's Word with Tom Bradford, visit Torah Class today on the web, streaming TV, or download the Torah Class mobile app.